I watched in horror as my prize bulls charged across the pasture, their massive hooves thundering against the earth like a freight train. Screaming families abandoned their picnic tables and sprinted toward their cars, children crying as they clutched their parents' hands. Sheriff Karen stood frozen beside her patrol cruiser, her face white with terror as Thunder, my lead bull, snorted and pawed the ground just 20 feet away from her. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. The war between us had finally begun. The morning mist clung to my pastures like a soft blanket, and I could hear the gentle lowing of my cattle echoing across the rolling hills. I had built this ranch with my own 2 hands over 15 years, every fence post driven into the ground with sweat and determination. This was my sanctuary, my piece of heaven on earth. My name is Jake, and I owned 40 acres of prime grazing land just outside the small town of Millbrook. Every morning at sunrise, I would walk the fence line with my coffee mug, checking on my herd of 13 bulls. They were magnificent creatures, each one weighing over 1,500 pounds, with Thunder being the crown jewel of my operation. He was a massive black Angus with intelligent eyes and a protective nature that had kept my herd safe for years. The routine never got old. I would fill the water troughs, check the mineral feeders, and spend time just watching these gentle giants graze in the morning sun. My neighbors respected the boundaries of my property, and I respected theirs. We had that unspoken understanding that comes from generations of rural living. But things were changing in Millbrook. The town was growing, and with growth came new faces, new ideas, and new problems. The biggest change had come 6 months earlier when Karen Stevens was appointed as our new sheriff. She was a transplant from the city, someone who had moved to our area with big plans to modernize everything. I first heard about Corinne through conversations at the local diner. People talked about her ambitious plans for community engagement and her desire to bring the town together through organized events. She seemed harmless enough, just another city person trying to make their mark on small-town life. My first real interaction with Corinne came when she drove by my property in her shiny patrol cruiser. She would slow down and stare at my pastures with an expression I could not quite read. Sometimes she would stop and take pictures with her phone, always from the road, never stepping onto my property. I waved politely whenever I saw her, but she never waved back. The other change in town was the growing influence of the homeowners association. These were mostly new residents who had moved to Millbrook seeking the rural lifestyle, but wanted to maintain their suburban standards. They were led by a group of women who seemed to have endless time for meetings and planning community events. I had nothing against community events in principle. I had lived in Millbrook my entire life and had participated in county fairs, church picnics, and school fundraisers. But these new events felt different. They felt entitled, as if the entire town existed for their entertainment. My cattle had become accustomed to the quiet rhythm of ranch life. They trusted me, and I trusted them. Thunder, in particular, had developed a bond with me that went beyond the typical farmer-livestock relationship. He would come when I called his name, and he had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong. The peace I had worked so hard to build was about to be shattered in ways I never could have imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when Sheriff Karen pulled into my driveway. I was repairing a section of fence when I heard the crunch of gravel under her tires. She stepped out of her patrol cruiser with the confidence of someone who expected to get exactly what she wanted. "Good morning, Jake," she said, adjusting her badge and walking toward me with a practiced smile. "I hope you have a few minutes to talk about an exciting opportunity for our community." I set down my tools and wiped my hands on my jeans. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Karen gestured toward my pastures with a sweeping motion. I have been thinking about your beautiful property here. You have so much open space, and it would be perfect for community gatherings. The Homeowners Association has been looking for a venue for their monthly picnics and seasonal events. The way she said it made it sound like a done deal, not a request. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized where this conversation was heading. I appreciate the interest, I said carefully, but this is a working ranch. My bulls need quiet grazing areas, and I have liability concerns about having large groups of people around livestock. Karen's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Oh, I am sure we can work around any concerns you might have. The community really needs this, Jake. We are trying to build something special here in Millbrook. Before I could respond, 3 cars pulled up behind her patrol cruiser. Out stepped 6 women, all perfectly dressed and carrying clipboards. They walked onto my property without invitation, spreading out across my front pasture like they were conducting a real estate inspection. "Ladies, come see this space," Karen called out to them. "Is this not exactly what we were looking for?" I watched in disbelief as these strangers examined my property, pointing at different areas and taking notes. One woman walked dangerously close to the fence where Thunder was grazing, causing him to snort and back away. "Excuse me," I said, raising my voice. "I did not give anyone permission to walk around my property." The women looked at me with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance. One of them, a blonde woman in expensive yoga clothes, spoke up. "We were told this was all arranged. Karen said you were excited to host community events." I turned to Karen, feeling heat rise in my chest. "I never agreed to anything. This is private property, and I need you all to leave." Karen stepped closer to me, her hand resting casually on her duty belt. "Now, Jake, let us not be hasty. These ladies have spent a lot of time planning, and they are just trying to do something nice for the community. Surely you can spare a few acres for the greater good." "The greater good," I repeated, incredulous. "This is my livelihood. These bulls are worth more than most people's cars. I cannot have strangers wandering around them." "Well," Karen said, her voice taking on a different tone, "I certainly hope you are maintaining all the proper permits and health department requirements for your operation. It would be a shame if someone filed a complaint about safety violations or zoning issues." The threat was clear, even though she delivered it with that same practiced smile. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. "Are you threatening me, Sheriff?" "Of course not," she replied. "I am just reminding you that running a business requires compliance with many regulations. My department works very closely with all the other county agencies. We tend to notice when properties might need closer inspection." The women continued their unauthorized tour of my property while Karen and I stared at each other. I could see Thunder watching us from across the pasture, his ears forward and alert. Even he could sense the tension in the air. "I want you all off my property," I said quietly. "Now." Karen's smile finally faded. "Think about it, Jake. Think about what is best for everyone involved." Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. I was in my barn, checking on a bull that had been favoring one hoof, when I heard the sound of multiple car doors slamming. The sound came from the direction of my front pasture, which was strange because visitors always came to the house first. I walked outside and felt my blood pressure spike. There were at least 15 cars parked along my fence line, and families were streaming through my front gate like they owned the place. Folding tables were being set up in my best grazing area, and someone was unloading a massive barbecue grill from the back of a pickup truck. Children were running through the pasture, screaming and chasing each other while their parents unpacked coolers and set up lawn chairs. The noise was incredible, and I could see my bulls gathered at the far end of the field, agitated and confused by the chaos. I ran toward the group, my heart pounding with disbelief and rage. "Hey, what are you doing? This is private property." A man in a polo shirt looked up from his grill setup. "Oh, you must be Jake. Karen told us you were excited to host our community picnic. Thanks for letting us use your land." "I never agreed to this," I shouted. "You are all trespassing." Several families stopped their activities and stared at me like I was the problem. A woman holding a toddler shook her head disapprovingly. "There is no need to be hostile. We are just trying to have a nice family gathering." I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911, but before I could complete the call, Sheriff Karen's patrol cruiser pulled up. She stepped out in full uniform, her hand resting on her radio. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. But she was looking at me, not at the dozens of people illegally occupying my property. "Yes, there is a problem," I said. "These people are trespassing on my land without permission." Karen walked closer to me, her expression stern. "Jake, I am getting reports that you are disturbing the peace and harassing families who are just trying to enjoy a community event." "They are on my property," I repeated, feeling like I was losing my mind. "I never gave permission for this." "Well, that is not what I heard," Karen said calmly. "Multiple witnesses told me you were enthusiastic about hosting this picnic. Now, I am going to need you to lower your voice and stop intimidating these families." I looked around at the faces staring at me. Some looked confused, others looked annoyed, and a few looked genuinely afraid. Karen had somehow made me the villain in this situation. "If you continue to cause a disturbance," Karen continued, "I will have no choice but to place you under arrest for disorderly conduct and harassment." The injustice of it hit me like a physical blow. I was being threatened with arrest on my own property for objecting to an illegal gathering. I watched helplessly as more families continued to arrive, treating my ranch like a public park. Someone had brought a portable speaker system, and loud music began echoing across the pasture. Thunder and the other bulls were now pressed against the back fence, as far from the noise as they could get. I could see the stress in their body language, the way they kept shifting and snorting. A group of teenagers had discovered my equipment shed and were taking selfies with my tractors. Two young boys were throwing rocks at my fence posts, trying to see who could hit them the hardest. The disrespect was overwhelming. "This is my property," I said to Karen, my voice shaking with controlled anger. "These people are damaging my land and terrifying my livestock." "I see a community coming together," Karen replied. "I see families enjoying themselves in a safe, open space. What I do not see is any actual damage or danger." Just then, a child's scream pierced the air. A little girl had wandered too close to the fence line, and Thunder had approached to investigate. The massive bull was not being aggressive, just curious, but his size was terrifying to someone who had never been around livestock. "See," Karen said, pointing at the crying child. "Your animals are the real danger here. Maybe we need to discuss whether this is an appropriate place for cattle." I stared at her in disbelief. She was twisting every situation to fit her narrative, using her authority to intimidate me while protecting the people who were actually breaking the law. The picnic continued for 6 hours. By the time they finally left, my pasture looked like a war zone. Monday morning found me sitting in the Millbrook City Hall, waiting to file a formal complaint about the illegal trespass. The damage to my property was extensive: trampled grass, broken fence boards and garbage scattered across my best grazing area. More importantly, my bulls were still skittish and refusing to graze in the area where the picnic had been held. The desk clerk, a middle-aged woman named Betty, listened to my story with a sympathetic expression. But when I mentioned Sheriff Corinne's involvement, her demeanor changed completely. "Oh, well, if Sheriff Stevens was there, I am sure everything was handled properly," Betty said, avoiding eye contact. "Maybe there was just a misunderstanding about the arrangements." "There was no misunderstanding," I insisted. "I never gave permission for anyone to use my property." Betty shuffled through some papers nervously. "I will make sure your complaint is filed, but you should know that Sheriff Stevens has been working very hard to bring the community together. The mayor is very supportive of her initiatives." My next stop was the mayor's office. Mayor Thompson had been in office for 12 years, and I had voted for him in every election. Surely he would listen to reason. "Jake, good to see you," he said, but his handshake was weaker than usual. "I heard there was some kind of incident over the weekend." I explained the situation again, showing him photos of the damage on my phone. He nodded along, making appropriate sounds of concern, but I could tell he was not really listening. "The thing is, Jake, Sheriff Stevens is doing amazing work for our community. Her approval ratings are through the roof, and she has brought in 3 new businesses just this month. Sometimes we have to make small sacrifices for the greater good." "Small sacrifices," I repeated. "They trespassed on my property and caused thousands of dollars in damage." Mayor Thompson leaned back in his chair. "Maybe you could work with Corinne to find a compromise. She mentioned that you might be interested in hosting regular community events. Think of the positive publicity for your ranch." I left City Hall feeling more frustrated than when I had arrived. It was clear that Corinne had gotten to everyone first, spinning the story to make herself look like a community hero and me look like an obstructionist. My last hope was the county attorney's office. I drove 30 minutes to the county seat, hoping to find someone who was not under Corinne's influence. The county attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells, listened to my entire story without interruption. When I finished, she leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "Mr. Jake, I have to be honest with you. Fighting a sitting sheriff is an uphill battle. They have connections throughout the system, and juries tend to trust law enforcement officers. Even if you are completely in the right, the legal costs could bankrupt you." "So I just have to accept this?" I asked. "I am not saying that," she replied carefully. "But you need to understand what you are up against. Sheriff Stevens has been building political capital since she took office. She knows how to work the system." I drove home in silence, realizing that the system I had trusted my entire life was not going to protect me. Corinne had outmaneuvered me at every turn, using her badge and her political connections to make herself untouchable. That night, I sat on my porch and watched my bulls grazing in the moonlight. They were finally starting to return to their normal patterns, but I could see the wariness in their movements. They had learned that their sanctuary was not as safe as they had believed. Sleep became impossible. I spent 3 nights lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Corinne's smug smile. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her threatening me on my own property while trespassers destroyed my land. The system had failed me completely, and I was running out of options. On the 4th night, I gave up on sleep and walked out to the pasture. The bulls were resting in the cool darkness, their massive forms barely visible in the starlight. Thunder lifted his head as I approached, recognizing my footsteps even in the dark. "What do you think, old boy?" I whispered, scratching behind his ears. They want to use our land for their parties. Maybe it is time they met the real owners. The idea formed slowly, like a storm building on the horizon. These bulls were not just livestock. They were 1,500 pounds of pure muscle and territorial instinct. For thousands of years, cattle had been used to protect property and defend their territory. Maybe it was time to let them do what nature intended. I spent the next day researching livestock protection laws. What I found was encouraging. Property owners had broad rights to protect their land, especially when law enforcement failed to respond to legitimate complaints. Cattle had been used for property defense since ancient times, and the laws reflected that reality. But this was not just about legal protection. This was about justice, about standing up to corruption when the system failed. I had to be smart about it, though. Karen would be looking for any excuse to arrest me, and I could not give her one. I began studying my bull's behavior patterns more carefully than ever before. Thunder was the natural leader, protective and intelligent. When strangers entered his territory, he would investigate first, then signal the others if he perceived a threat. The younger bulls followed his lead, creating a coordinated response to intruders. I started adjusting their feeding schedule, moving them closer to the front pasture where Karen's group would likely set up their next illegal gathering. I repaired the gates between the pastures, making sure they would open easily when the time came. Every detail had to be perfect. The moral weight of what I was planning settled heavily on my shoulders. Was I crossing a line from victim to vigilante? But then I remembered the laughter of the trespassers, Karen's threats, and the stress in my animal's eyes during the picnic. This was not revenge. This was restoration of natural order. I researched Karen's patterns, learning when the HOA group typically held their gatherings. They seemed to favor Saturday mornings, and based on conversations I overheard at the diner, they were planning another event soon. The excitement in their voices as they discussed their new venue made my jaw clench. 3 weeks after the first illegal picnic, I got confirmation. Betty at City Hall let it slip that another community event was scheduled for the following Saturday. She mentioned it casually, assuming I was now on board with the program. "I hope you are planning something special for the families," she said with a smile. "The children especially loved having so much space to run around." "Oh, I am planning something special," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Something they will never forget." That night, I made my final preparations. I moved Thunder and 6 other bulls to the holding pasture adjacent to the front field. I checked the gate mechanisms one more time, ensuring they would open smoothly. I positioned myself where I could see the entire area while remaining hidden from view. The moral struggle continued to gnaw at me. I was not a violent person, and I had never sought conflict with anyone. But sometimes, when justice fails and authority becomes corrupt, ordinary people have to take extraordinary measures. I thought about my grandfather, who had built the original cabin on this land. He had faced down claim jumpers and cattle rustlers with nothing but determination, and the belief that a man had the right to protect what was his. He would have understood what I was about to do. As I lay in bed that final night, I made peace with my decision. I was not trying to hurt anyone. I was simply going to let nature take its course. The bulls would do what bulls do when their territory is invaded by strangers. Karen had used her badge to intimidate me. Tomorrow, she would learn that badges mean nothing to 1,500 pounds of territorial beef. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that made people want to spend time outdoors. I was in position by 7 in the morning, hidden behind my equipment shed with a clear view of the front pasture. The bulls were in the adjacent field, grazing peacefully but alert to any changes in their environment. The first cars arrived at 9:30 and I felt my pulse quicken. It was the same routine as before, families piling out of vehicles, unloading tables and grills, and spreading across my property like they owned it. But this time, they brought even more people. Word had apparently spread about their new venue, and the crowd was nearly double the size of the first illegal gathering. Children ran through the grass, screaming with delight, while adults set up an elaborate buffet station. Someone had brought a bounce house, which they inflated right in the middle of my best grazing area. The disrespect was staggering. At 10:15, Sheriff Karen arrived in her patrol cruiser. She stepped out in full uniform, surveying the scene with obvious satisfaction. She walked through the crowd like a queen inspecting her domain, accepting compliments and thanks from grateful families. I watched her position herself near the gate, clearly ready to intimidate me if I showed up to object. She had no idea that I was already there, hidden and waiting for the perfect moment. The crowd grew larger and more spread out. Families claimed territories throughout the pasture, setting up elaborate picnic areas and letting their children wander freely. The noise was incredible: music, laughter, shouting, and the constant chatter of dozens of conversations. At 11 o'clock, when the crowd was at its largest and most relaxed, I made my move. I approached the gate between the pastures, staying low and out of sight. Thunder was grazing nearby, and he lifted his massive head as I approached. I could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the awareness that something was different about this day. "Easy boy," I whispered, placing my hand on the gate latch. "Time to show them whose land this really is." I opened the gate and stepped back. Thunder was the first to notice the opening. He walked through slowly, his head high and alert. The other bulls followed in single file, their hooves making soft thuds on the grass. For a moment they just stood there, taking in the chaotic scene before them. Then Thunder caught the scent of strangers in his territory. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Thunder's posture changed from curious to aggressive in an instant. He lowered his head, snorted loudly, and began advancing toward the nearest group of picnickers. The sound that came from his throat was primal and unmistakable, a challenge to intruders. The other bulls spread out behind him, forming a loose line as they advanced. 12 animals, each weighing over 1,500 pounds, moving with purpose and determination. The ground literally shook under their hooves. The first scream came from a woman near the bounce house. She looked up from her sandwich and saw Thunder approaching, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning sun. Her shriek pierced the air, causing heads to turn throughout the pasture. Chaos erupted instantly. Families grabbed their children and ran for their cars. Picnic tables were overturned as people scrambled to escape. Coolers and grills were abandoned as the crowd surged toward the fence line in a panic. Karen's composure shattered completely. I watched her fumble for her radio, her patrol car, anything that might give her control over the situation. But there was no controlling this. The bulls were not attacking anyone. They were simply reclaiming their territory, and their presence was absolutely terrifying to people who had never been around livestock. Thunder approached Karen's position with deliberate steps. She backed against her patrol cruiser, her face white with terror, as the massive bull stopped just 20 feet away. He snorted and pawed the ground, making it clear that she was not welcome in his domain. The retreat was complete and humiliating. Cars peeled out of the parking area, kicking up clouds of dust. Children cried as their parents threw them into backseats and sped away. The elaborate picnic setup was abandoned completely. Tables, chairs, grills, and the deflated bounce house scattered across the pasture like debris from a tornado. Within 10 minutes, the property was empty except for the bulls and the abandoned remnants of the illegal gathering. Thunder stood in the center of the field, his head high and proud, while the other bulls spread out to investigate the strange objects left behind. I walked into the pasture, and Thunder approached me calmly. I scratched behind his ears as he nuzzled my shoulder, completely gentle now that the intruders were gone. "Good boy," I whispered. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Karen's patrol cruiser was still visible in the distance, parked on the road. I could see her talking frantically into her radio, probably trying to figure out how to spin this disaster into something she could control. But this time, she had no power over the situation. The bulls had spoken in a language older than badges and authority, and everyone had understood perfectly. The phone started ringing before I even made it back to the house. The first call was from Karen, her voice shaking with rage and what sounded like genuine fear. "What you did was reckless and dangerous," she shouted. "I am filing charges against you for reckless endangerment, assault, and terroristic threats." "I opened a gate on my own property," I replied calmly. "My cattle were simply protecting their territory from trespassers. Maybe you should have thought about that before you brought those families onto private land without permission." "You planned this," she accused. "You deliberately endangered innocent people." "I did not endanger anyone," I said. "You did when you brought them onto property where they had no right to be. Livestock protection laws are very clear about this, Sheriff. You might want to read them." The phone slammed down, but it rang again almost immediately. This time it was a reporter from the local newspaper, asking for my side of the story. Word was spreading fast, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. "So you are saying Sheriff Stevens brought people onto your property without permission?" she asked. "That is exactly what I am saying. I have security camera footage of the entire incident, including the sheriff threatening me when I tried to remove the trespassers." Within hours, the story was on social media. Someone had filmed the retreat on their phone, and the video of families running from my bulls was going viral. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of my actions, with many people sharing their own stories of dealing with entitled officials and property rights violations. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. The narrative was not what Karen had hoped for. Instead of portraying me as a dangerous rancher, the media was framing it as a property owner's creative solution to police-sanctioned trespassing. The district attorney's office called that afternoon. I expected to be facing charges, but the conversation went differently than I had anticipated. "Mr. Jake, we have reviewed the incident report and the available evidence," the prosecutor said. "While Sheriff Stevens has requested charges against you, we have some concerns about the circumstances surrounding the incident." "What kind of concerns?" I asked. "Well, for starters, there is clear evidence that multiple people were trespassing on your property without permission. You had previously filed complaints about this behavior, and those complaints were not properly addressed. Additionally, livestock protection laws give property owners broad authority to protect their land and animals." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, but the conclusion was clear. There would be no charges filed against me. The district attorney's office was more concerned about the liability issues surrounding Karen's actions than they were about my response to them. The real breakthrough came when other neighbors started coming forward with their own stories. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 2 miles down the road, told reporters about Karen pressuring her to allow parking on her property for community events. The Kowalski family shared a story about Karen threatening health department inspections when they refused to remove their livestock from areas visible from the road. A pattern of abuse and intimidation was emerging, and Karen's reputation was crumbling under the scrutiny. The HOA group, embarrassed by their association with the scandal, quickly distanced themselves from Karen and canceled all future events. The county commissioners announced an investigation into the sheriff's department, citing concerns about misuse of authority and inappropriate relationships with special interest groups. Karen tried to control the narrative, but every statement she made seemed to make things worse. The bulls, meanwhile, had become local celebrities. People drove by just to see the animals that had stood up to Sheriff Karen. Children pointed at Thunder through the fence, and parents told the story of how the bulls had protected their owners' property rights. The transformation in community attitude was remarkable. People who had been afraid to speak out against Karen were now sharing their stories openly. The fear she had cultivated through intimidation was replaced by a sense of empowerment and justice. 3 weeks after the bull incident, the announcement came in a terse press release from the county sheriff's department. Sheriff Karen Stevens has submitted her resignation, effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue new opportunities outside of law enforcement. I was fixing a water trough when my neighbor, Tom Bradley, drove up with a copy of the newspaper. "Thought you would want to see this," he said with a grin, handing me the front page. The headline read, "Sheriff Resigns Amid Abuse of Power Investigation." The article detailed the findings of the county investigation, which had uncovered a pattern of intimidation, favoritism, and misuse of authority that extended far beyond my case. Karen had been using her badge to pressure property owners, threaten business owners, and advance the agenda of her political allies. "Good riddance," Tom said. "That woman caused more problems in 6 months than we had seen in 6 years." The new sheriff, appointed by the county commissioners, was Deputy Martinez, a 20-year veteran with deep roots in the community. His first official act was to visit every property owner who had filed complaints against Karen, apologizing for the department's failures and promising a return to community-focused policing. When he arrived at my ranch, I was impressed by his approach. He parked outside my gate and waited for me to invite him onto the property. He spoke respectfully about my cattle and asked thoughtful questions about ranch management. "I want you to know that property rights are sacred," he told me. "My department will respond to every trespassing complaint, and we will not tolerate anyone using our badge to intimidate law-abiding citizens." The legal protections for my property were stronger than ever. The county attorney's office had drafted new ordinances specifically addressing property rights violations, and the incident with Karen had become a case study in livestock protection law. My insurance company, initially concerned about the liability implications of the bull incident, had reversed their position after reviewing the legal precedents. They actually reduced my premiums, noting that my proactive approach to property protection had prevented more serious incidents. The physical damage to my property healed quickly. The trampled grass grew back, and the broken fence boards were replaced with stronger materials. But the changes ran deeper than cosmetic repairs. New, no trespassing signs, backed by county ordinances and state livestock protection laws, made it clear that my property was not a public park. The bulls had returned to their normal routines, but they carried themselves differently now. Thunder, in particular, seemed more confident, more aware of his role as protector of the herd. Visitors to the area would often stop at the fence to take respectful photos, and Thunder would approach curiously, no longer wary of strangers who respected boundaries. The community's attitude toward my ranch had transformed completely. Instead of seeing me as an obstacle to progress, people now viewed me as someone who had stood up to corruption and won. Parents pointed out my bulls to their children, telling the story of how livestock had restored justice when the legal system failed. Local schools started bringing field trips to the ranch, and I found myself educating children about agriculture, property rights, and the importance of standing up for what is right. The story of the bull release had become local legend, passed down as an example of how ordinary people can fight back against abuse of power. The HOA group had dissolved completely after the scandal. Many of the families involved had been genuinely unaware of the legal issues surrounding their use of my property, and they were embarrassed by their association with Corinne's schemes. Several had personally apologized, and we had worked out neighborly arrangements for their children to learn about cattle from a safe distance. On quiet evenings, I would sit on my porch and watch the bulls grazing in the golden light. Thunder would often lift his head and look toward the house, as if checking to make sure I was still there. The bond between us had deepened through our shared experience of defending our territory. The lesson had been learned by everyone involved. Property rights were not suggestions to be ignored by entitled officials. Authority without legitimacy was just another form of trespassing. And sometimes, when human systems fail, it takes the honest response of animals to restore justice. The bulls had taught Corinne what the courts could not, that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequences, and that true authority comes not from a badge, but from the respect of those you serve. Justice had been served, one thundering hoofbeat at a time.